The silence was deafening as Major Brett Razor Kingston stared at the faded kill markings painted beneath the cockpit of the P-51 Mustang he'd been mocking all morning. 12 small enemy aircraft silhouettes, each representing a confirmed air-to-air kill in combat zones most people only read about in history books. The woman they'd dismissed as a weekend warrior playing with museum pieces had more confirmed kills than his entire F-22 squadron combined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm pierced the pre-dawn darkness at 0430 hours, but Captain Victoria Vega Cross was already awake, her eyes fixed on the ceiling of her modest ranch house bedroom in Clearwater, Florida. Today wasn't just another day. It was the day she'd been both anticipating and dreading for months. Her first appearance at the Wings Over America Air Festival at MacDill Air Force Base, where she'd be participating in the Heritage Flight Program alongside some of the military's most elite pilots. At 42, Victoria carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen more than most people could imagine. Her graying auburn hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and her weathered hands told stories of countless hours gripping aircraft controls in conditions that would terrify civilian pilots. As a retired Air Force captain with over 20 years of service, she'd flown everything from cargo transports to close air support missions, but her heart had always belonged to fighters. Victoria's morning routine was as precise as her flying. Black coffee, strong enough to wake the dead, followed by a thorough weather check and inspection of her pride and joy, a meticulously restored 1944 P-51 Mustang she'd named Knight Rider. The aircraft sat in her private hangar like a sleeping predator, its polished aluminum skin gleaming under the fluorescent lights. To most people, it was a beautiful piece of aviation history. To Victoria, it was something far more personal. The Mustang hadn't been restored, it had been reborn. Victoria had spent 7 years and most of her military savings bringing the warbird back to not just airworthy condition, but to combat-ready specifications. Every rivet, every wire, every component had either been perfectly restored or upgraded with modern equivalents that maintained the aircraft's original character. The Merlin V12 engine had been completely rebuilt, producing the same thunderous 1,490 horsepower that had carried Allied pilots to victory over Europe 8 decades earlier. But this wasn't just a hobby for Victoria. The Heritage Flight Program paired vintage warbirds with modern military aircraft for airshow demonstrations, symbolizing the continuity between past and present air power. For her, it represented something deeper, a chance to honor the warriors who'd flown these machines in anger, and perhaps to prove that the lessons learned in older conflicts still had value in the age of stealth fighters and precision weapons. Victoria's phone buzzed with a text from her younger brother Marcus, a commercial airline pilot based in Atlanta. "Break a leg today, sis. Show those hotshot fighter jocks what real flying looks like." She smiled, remembering how Marcus had always been her biggest supporter, even when their father had questioned whether the military was the right choice for his daughter. Growing up in a family of aviators, her grandfather had flown B-17s over Germany. Her father had been a Navy pilot in Vietnam. Victoria had always felt the pull of the sky, but breaking into the fighter pilot community as a woman in the late 1990s had been like navigating a minefield blindfolded. She'd faced skepticism, outright hostility, and countless attempts to wash her out of flight training. Every achievement had to be earned twice over. Every mistake was magnified, and every success was attributed to luck or lowered standards. The irony wasn't lost on her that today she'd likely face similar attitudes from a new generation of pilots who viewed vintage aircraft as museum pieces and their pilots as weekend warriors playing with dress-up. The F-22 Raptor pilots she'd be flying alongside represented the pinnacle of modern air superiority. Stealth technology, advanced avionics, and weapon systems that could engage targets beyond visual range. Their aircraft cost $150 million each and required entire support teams to maintain. Victoria's Mustang, by contrast, had cost the original Army Air Forces about $50,000 in 1944 dollars. It carried no radar, no electronic warfare systems, no guided missiles. What it had was something that couldn't be measured in dollars or technical specifications: heritage, proven combat effectiveness, and the accumulated wisdom of pilots who'd learned to fight when losing meant dying. As she performed her pre-flight inspection, Victoria ran her fingers along the aircraft's skin, checking for any imperfections that might affect performance. The Mustang was more than ready. She'd spent the previous week fine-tuning every system, adjusting control surfaces, and calibrating instruments. The real question was whether she was ready to face the inevitable condescension and dismissal that would come from pilots young enough to be her children. The drive to MacDill Air Force Base took her through the awakening Florida landscape, past palm trees swaying in the Gulf breeze and early commuters beginning their daily routines. Victoria's mind wandered to the missions that had defined her military career: close air support runs over Afghanistan, escort duties in hostile airspace, and training exercises where she'd consistently outperformed pilots flying much more advanced aircraft. She'd learned that technology was only as good as the pilot using it, and that experience often trumped equipment when the stakes were real. Her Mustang followed behind on a custom trailer, carefully secured and covered. To casual observers, it looked like an expensive hobby being transported to an air show. They couldn't see the countless hours of combat-tested modifications, the upgraded avionics that maintained the aircraft's vintage appearance while providing modern safety and navigation capabilities, or the pilot who'd proven herself in conditions where second place meant not coming home. Victoria had volunteered for the Heritage Flight Program, not for glory or recognition, but because she believed deeply in the mission, connecting past and present, showing young pilots that aviation excellence wasn't invented yesterday, and honoring the legacy of those who'd paid the ultimate price for the freedoms modern warriors defended. She'd also hoped to find common ground with the current generation of fighter pilots, to share hard-earned lessons about air combat that couldn't be learned in simulators or textbooks. She hadn't anticipated just how dramatically her presence would challenge the assumptions and egos of pilots who'd never faced an enemy that could shoot back, who'd learned to fly in an era where American air superiority was taken for granted, and who viewed anything older than their training aircraft as obsolete. The collision between old-school aviation wisdom and new-age technological arrogance was about to create sparks that would light up the Florida sky. As MacDill Air Force Base came into view, with its towering control tower and sprawling flight line filled with modern military aircraft, Victoria felt the familiar pre-mission flutter in her stomach, not fear, but anticipation. Today would test more than flying skills. It would test character, respect, and the timeless question of whether experience could overcome expectation. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows across the tarmac where ground crews were already preparing for the day's activities. Victoria could see the distinctive angular silhouettes of F-22 Raptors positioned near the main hangar, their stealth coating giving them an almost alien appearance compared to the conventional aircraft around them. Soon, she'd meet the pilots who flew these technological marvels and discover whether the warrior spirit that had carried her through 2 decades of military service would be enough to earn their respect. The stage was set for a confrontation that would challenge everything these young pilots thought they knew about air combat, aircraft capabilities, and the meaning of true aerial warfare experience.
The security checkpoint at MacDill Air Force Base processed Victoria's credentials with military efficiency, but she caught the subtle double takes from the guards when they realized she wasn't just another air show spectator. Her retired military ID and Heritage Flight Program authorization opened doors that remained closed to civilians. Yet she could sense the quiet curiosity about what a middle-aged woman was doing among the elite pilots gathering for one of the year's most prestigious aviation events. The drive through the base revealed a world where cutting-edge technology and military tradition coexisted in carefully maintained harmony. Modern fighter jets sat beside vintage aircraft, their contrasting designs telling the story of aviation's rapid evolution. But it was the human element that caught Victoria's attention. Young airmen and officers moving with the confident swagger that came from belonging to the world's most powerful air force. Victoria's destination was Hangar 7, designated for Heritage flight participants and their aircraft. As her pickup truck and trailer rounded the corner of the massive structure, she felt her breath catch. The sight before her was both inspiring and intimidating, a collection of military aviation's finest, from World War II fighters to modern stealth aircraft, all sharing the same sacred ground. 3 F-22 Raptors dominated the center of the hangar, their angular, predatory shapes seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even at rest, they projected an aura of lethal capability that spoke to decades of aerospace engineering advancement. Around them, ground crews worked with practiced precision, performing pre-flight inspections and maintenance with the reverence reserved for instruments of national defense. But it was the human element that caught Victoria's attention and concern. Even from a distance, she could read their body language, confident to the point of arrogance, comfortable in their superiority, and completely unaware that their assumptions were about to be challenged. Major Brett "Razor" Kingston stood at the center of the group like a general commanding his troops. At 34, he embodied everything the modern fighter pilot was supposed to be: tall, athletic, movie star handsome, with perfectly pressed flight suits and an air of unshakable confidence. His voice carried across the hangar as he gestured toward the vintage aircraft, clearly entertaining his squadron with commentary that made them laugh at someone else's expense. "I hear we're supposed to fly formation with some of these museum pieces," Kingston was saying, his tone dripping with condescension. "I just hope they can keep up long enough to make the crowd happy before we have to escort them back to the retirement home." Captain Alex Martinez, a compact man with intense dark eyes, and the kind of precision-trimmed mustache that spoke to vanity as much as regulation, nodded in agreement. "The Heritage Flight Program is just public relations theater. Parade around some antiques to make the history buffs feel good, then let the real aircraft show what modern air power looks like." Lieutenant Connor Blazehays, clearly the youngest of the group, laughed with the enthusiasm of someone desperate to fit in with his older, more experienced squadron mates. "My grandfather flew one of those old birds in Korea, always talked about how they were the best fighters ever built. I guess every generation thinks their toys were the greatest." Captain Nathan Titan Reed, distinguished by premature gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd seen more action than his companions, remained silent but nodded along with their conversation. As the squadron's senior captain, his approval carried weight, even when given through passive agreement. Victoria parked her truck and began the methodical process of unloading her Mustang from its trailer. The aircraft emerged like a sleeping giant awakening, its polished aluminum skin catching the hangar's fluorescent lights and throwing them back in brilliant reflections. Even covered in protective wrapping, Knight Rider commanded attention with the unmistakable lines that had made the P-51 one of aviation history's most recognizable fighters. The process of removing the protective covers and preparing the aircraft for display was one Victoria had performed countless times, but never under such scrutiny. She could feel eyes on her from across the hangar, could sense the moment when the F-22 pilots noticed that the pilot of the museum piece wasn't the retired male aviator they'd expected. "Well, would you look at that?" Kingston's voice carried clearly across the hangar, though he made no effort to lower it. "Looks like someone brought their grandmother's plane to the party." The comment drew chuckles from his audience, but Victoria continued her work without acknowledgement. She'd learned long ago that responding to such provocations only escalated them. Better to let her actions speak when the time was right.
Master Sergeant Lisa Gears Thompson, the hangar's senior crew chief, approached with the no-nonsense stride of someone who'd spent decades maintaining military aircraft. Her weathered face and grease-stained hands told the story of countless hours keeping flying machines in perfect condition, and her eyes held the wisdom that came from seeing technology evolve from propellers to stealth. "Ma'am, I'm Sergeant Thompson," she said, offering her hand to Victoria. "I'll be your assigned crew chief for the duration of the event. That's a beautiful bird you've got there." Victoria shook the sergeant's hand, immediately recognizing a kindred spirit, someone who understood that respect was earned through competence, not bestowed through rank or gender. "Thank you, Sergeant. She's been a labor of love for the better part of a decade." As they spoke, Thompson's experienced eyes took in details that escaped casual observation.
The Mustang's engine cowling showed signs of recent maintenance, its propeller had been professionally balanced, and the control surfaces moved with the precise freedom that indicated expert rigging. This wasn't a static display aircraft maintained for show. This was a combat-ready fighter maintained to operational standards. "Mind if I ask what you've got under the hood?" Thompson inquired, her professional curiosity evident. "Packard-built Merlin V1650-7, Victoria replied, a note of pride creeping into her voice. "Completely rebuilt with modern metallurgy but original specifications. Produces about 1,500 horsepower on a good day." Thompson whistled appreciatively. "And avionics?" "Period-correct instruments with hidden modern navigation and communication systems," Victoria explained. "She looks exactly like she did in 1944, but she's got everything needed to fly safely in modern airspace." Their conversation was interrupted by the approach of the F-22 pilots, who'd apparently decided that the new arrival warranted closer inspection. Kingston led the group with the swagger of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, his squadron following like disciples eager to witness their leader's wit. "Excuse me," Kingston said, his tone carrying the false politeness that preceded an insult. "I'm Major Kingston, squadron commander for the 95th Fighter Squadron. I couldn't help but notice your aircraft." Victoria turned to face him, her expression neutral, but her eyes alert. "Captain Victoria Cross. Pleasure to meet you, Major." "Cross," Kingston repeated, as if testing the name for significance. "And you're participating in the Heritage Flight Program?" "That's correct." Kingston's eyes swept over the Mustang with the same expression he might reserve for examining roadkill. "Interesting choice. How long have you been flying vintage aircraft?" The pause before vintage was carefully calculated, designed to emphasize the gap between his modern fighters and her antique. Victoria recognized the tactic. She'd faced similar condescension throughout her military career. "I've been flying fighters for over 20 years, she replied simply. "Fighters?" Martinez interjected, his tone suggesting disbelief. "What kind of fighters?" Victoria's response was measured, professional. "Various types. My last assignment was with the 355th Fighter Wing at Davis-Monthan." The mention of Davis-Monthan, known as the Boneyard, where retired military aircraft went to die, drew smirks from the younger pilots. To them, it sounded like confirmation that she'd been relegated to flying obsolete aircraft at the end of a forgettable career. "Well," Kingston said, his smile not reaching his eyes, "I'm sure you'll find flying with modern aircraft educational. We'll try to keep the formation speeds down so you can keep up." The dismissal was clear, the insult wrapped in false concern. Victoria nodded politely, giving no indication that the barb had found its mark, but Master Sergeant Thompson, who'd been listening with growing irritation, stepped forward. "Major," she said, her voice carrying the authority that came from 3 decades of military service, "Captain Cross's aircraft is maintained to operational standards. I don't think you'll have any concerns about performance." Kingston's smile tightened at the gentle rebuke from an enlisted person, but protocol prevented him from responding directly. Instead, he turned back to Victoria with renewed condescension. "I'm sure it's a lovely museum piece. Just remember, we'll be flying formation with real combat aircraft. Safety is our primary concern." As the F-22 pilots walked away, their laughter echoing across the hangar, Victoria continued her methodical aircraft preparation. But something had shifted in the atmosphere. Lines had been drawn, assumptions had been made, and challenges had been issued. But what none of them realized was that they just awakened something that had been dormant for too long. The competitive fire that had carried Victoria through 2 decades of military service and more combat missions than all of them combined. The real show was about to begin. As the morning progressed, Victoria found herself inadvertently eavesdropping on conversations that revealed more about her F-22 counterparts than any formal introduction could have provided. The 95th Fighter Squadron wasn't just any group of pilots. They were the Air Force's poster children, hand-selected for their technical proficiency, media presence, and ability to represent American air power at its most polished. Major Brett "Razor" Kingston had earned his call sign not through combat experience, but through his razor-sharp precision in training exercises and his ability to cut through bureaucratic red tape to get what he wanted. At 34, he'd never seen actual combat, but his simulator scores were legendary. His tactical knowledge was textbook perfect, and his political instincts had fast-tracked him through the ranks. The F-22 program had been his ticket to elite status, and he wore that privilege like a custom-tailored flight suit. His second-in-command, Captain Alex "Storm" Martinez, represented the new breed of fighter pilot. Technically brilliant, academically gifted, and utterly convinced that technology had made previous generations of pilots obsolete. Storm had graduated summa cum laude from the Air Force Academy, completed Top Gun training in the top 5% of his class, and could recite performance specifications for every fighter aircraft in NATO's inventory. What he lacked was the humility that usually came from being shot at by people who wanted to kill him. Lieutenant Connor Blaze Hayes was the squadron's rising star, a 26-year-old whose reflexes and spatial awareness were so exceptional that his instructors had fast-tracked him through advanced training programs typically reserved for pilots with years more experience. Blaze flew with the fearless aggression of youth, pushing his aircraft to performance limits that made older pilots nervous. His only combat experience consisted of training exercises against pilots flying the same aircraft he did, a limitation he didn't recognize as a weakness. Captain Nathan "Titan" Reed was the closest thing the squadron had to a combat veteran, having flown support missions over Syria and Iraq, though always in environments where enemy air defenses had been suppressed by previous strikes. Titan's gray hair and serious demeanor gave him gravitas among his younger squadron mates, and his few actual combat sorties, however limited, provided enough credibility to validate the group's collective confidence. Their aircraft reflected their elite status. Each F-22 Raptor represented the pinnacle of aerospace technology, stealth capabilities that made them nearly invisible to radar, supercruise engines that could sustain supersonic flight without afterburners, and avionic systems that could track and engage multiple targets simultaneously at ranges measured in tens of miles. The aircraft cost $150 million each, required teams of specialists to maintain, and could only be flown by pilots who'd survived years of increasingly selective training programs. Everything about their operation screamed cutting-edge professionalism. Their flight suits were perfectly pressed, their equipment was state-of-the-art, and their ground crew moved with the choreographed precision of people who'd been trained to maintain the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. Even their casual conversations were peppered with technical jargon and tactical concepts that demonstrated their mastery of modern air combat doctrine. Victoria watched them from across the hangar as she continued preparing her Mustang, noting how they moved as a unit, how their conversation flowed seamlessly between technical discussions and casual banter, and how completely they dominated the social dynamics of the hangar. Other pilots deferred to them, ground crews prioritized their requests, and even senior officers treated them with the respect accorded to aerial nobility. "Check out the paint job on that thing," Martinez was saying, gesturing toward Victoria's Mustang with barely concealed amusement. "Someone spent serious money making that museum piece look authentic." Hayes laughed, his youthful voice carrying across the hangar. "My great-grandfather flew one of those in World War II. Always said they were hot stuff back in the day. Of course, back then they were fighting guys with cloth wings and fixed landing gear." "Different era," Reed added, with the authority of someone who'd actually been shot at. "Modern air combat is about sensors, stealth, and beyond visual range engagement. You never even see the enemy before you kill him. All that dogfighting romantic nonsense went out with propellers." Kingston nodded sagely, playing his role as the wise squadron commander. "The Heritage Flight program is good public relations, but let's be honest, it's basically a museum. Those old birds were impressive for their time, but comparing them to modern fighters is like comparing a Model T to a Formula One car." Their conversation was overheard by Colonel James "Thunder" Mitchell, the base commander and overall director of the Wings Over America Air Festival. Mitchell was old enough to remember when the Air Force still flew some of the aircraft now relegated to airshow duty, and experienced enough to recognize dangerous arrogance when he heard it.
"Gentlemen," Mitchell interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority that came from 3 decades of military leadership. "I trust you're making our Heritage Flight participants feel welcome?" Kingston straightened reflexively, his casual arrogance instantly replaced by professional deference. "Absolutely, sir. Just discussing the technical evolution of fighter aircraft." Mitchell's eyes swept across the group, noting their expensive equipment, perfect appearance, and barely concealed smugness. As someone who'd flown combat missions in aircraft that predated computer-controlled flight systems, he recognized the kind of technological arrogance that could get young pilots killed when they encountered situations their training hadn't anticipated. "The Heritage Flight Program exists for more than public relations," Mitchell said carefully. "It connects current pilots with combat experience and hard-earned wisdom of previous generations. Sometimes the old ways of doing things work better than the new ones." "Of course, sir," Martinez replied, his tone suggesting polite disagreement disguised as respect, though modern air combat doctrine has evolved considerably since propeller-driven aircraft were relevant. Mitchell's expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he was filing away the conversation for future reference. "Indeed it has, Captain. Just remember that evolution builds on foundation, and sometimes it's worth understanding what those foundations were built on." As the colonel moved away, the F-22 pilots exchanged glances that suggested they viewed his comments as nostalgic ramblings of an officer who'd failed to keep up with technological progress. They returned to their preparations with renewed confidence, secure in their superiority, and certain that the day's flying would demonstrate the vast gap between their capabilities and those of the museum-piece pilots. Victoria, meanwhile, had completed her pre-flight inspection and was now focusing on flight planning. Her charts were spread across a portable table, weighted down against the anchor's air currents, and covered with the kind of meticulous calculations that came from years of flying aircraft without computer assistance. She plotted wind corrections, calculated fuel consumption, and reviewed emergency procedures with the thoroughness of someone who'd learned that preparation was the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. The contrast between her methodical, old-school approach and the F-22 pilot's reliance on automated systems was stark. While they programmed flight computers and reviewed digital displays, she worked with paper charts, manual calculations, and the kind of fundamental aeronautical knowledge that had guided pilots long before satellites and GPS made navigation seem effortless. But what none of the F-22 pilots realized was that Victoria's seemingly outdated methods represented something they'd never experienced: the practical application of aeronautical knowledge in situations where technology couldn't provide answers, where split-second decisions were based on understanding aircraft performance at an intuitive level, and where survival depended on skills that couldn't be programmed into computers. The morning was advancing toward the afternoon briefing session, where all Heritage Flight participants would review formation procedures, emergency protocols, and the specific demonstration sequence planned for the public airshow. It would be the first time Victoria and the F-22 pilots would interact in a professional setting, where military protocol would govern their behavior and where first impressions would be formed based on demonstrated competence rather than assumptions about equipment. The stage was being set for a collision between old-school aviation expertise and new-age technological confidence, between pilots who'd learned their skills in combat and those who'd perfected them in simulators, between the accumulated wisdom of previous generations and the cutting-edge capabilities of the present. None of them could have predicted how dramatically that collision would challenge everything they thought they knew about flying, fighting, and the true meaning of aerial superiority.
The afternoon briefing room buzzed with the controlled energy of professional aviators preparing for complex flight operations. 24 pilots filled the space, representing everything from Vietnam-era F-4 Phantoms to modern F-35 Lightning IIs, but the social dynamics were unmistakable. The F-22 pilots had claimed the back corner of the room, their expensive flight gear and casual confidence marking them as the undisputed apex predators in this particular food chain. Victoria entered quietly, carrying her well-worn flight bag and a clipboard covered with handwritten notes. Her simple green flight suit bore no squadron patches, no sponsor logos, no indicators of elite status, just her name tape, rank insignia, and the basic accoutrements of someone who flew because she loved it, not because it made her special. The contrast was immediately apparent to everyone in the room. While other pilots sported flight suits adorned with unit patches, training school graduations, and military decorations, Victoria's appearance was almost austere in its simplicity. To the F-22 pilots, it confirmed their assumptions about her amateur status. "Look what the cat dragged in," Hayes whispered to his squadron mates, loud enough for several nearby pilots to hear. "Bet she bought that flight suit at a surplus store." Martinez snickered quietly. "Probably got her pilot's license from a Cracker Jack box." Colonel Mitchell called the briefing to order, his voice cutting through the pre-meeting chatter with military authority. "Gentlemen and ladies, welcome to the Wings Over America Heritage Flight Briefing. Today's demonstration will showcase 8 decades of American air power, from World War II fighters to our most advanced 5th-generation aircraft." As Mitchell outlined the formation flying procedures, Victoria took meticulous notes, her handwriting precise and her attention complete. The F-22 pilots, by contrast, seemed more interested in their own quiet commentary than the colonel's instructions. "Formation parameters will be based on the capabilities of our slowest aircraft," Mitchell continued, his eyes briefly finding Victoria. "Safety margins will be conservative, and all modern aircraft will adapt their performance to maintain formation integrity with our vintage participants." Kingston raised his hand with the confidence of someone accustomed to being heard. "Sir, what kind of performance limitations are we talking about? Will we be able to demonstrate the actual capabilities of modern fighters?" The question carried an implied criticism that wasn't lost on anyone in the room. Mitchell's expression remained neutral, but his response carried steel. "Major, the Heritage Flight Program is about formation flying and historical continuity, not individual aircraft performance demonstrations. If you're interested in showing off, I suggest you request assignment to the Thunderbirds." A few chuckles rippled through the room, but the F-22 pilot's expressions suggested they didn't appreciate being the target of the colonel's humor. Kingston's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he nodded with forced professionalism. "Of course, sir. Just want to ensure we're maximizing the educational value for the audience." As the briefing continued, the F-22 pilots' whispered commentary became increasingly pointed. They questioned everything from the safety protocols designed to accommodate older aircraft to the formation speeds that would, in their opinion, make modern fighters look like they were flying in slow motion. "This is embarrassing," Reed muttered during a discussion of emergency procedures. "We're going to look like we're flying in slow motion. Should have brought our trainers instead of operational aircraft. At least then the speed differential wouldn't be so obvious." Victoria continued taking notes, apparently oblivious to their comments, but other pilots in the room were beginning to notice the F-22 squadron's attitude. Captain Sarah Phoenix Williams, flying a restored F-86 Sabre, shot them a disapproving look that went unnoticed. Major Tom Gunslinger Rodriguez, representing the Korean War era with his F-4 Phantom, shook his head in disgust at their unprofessional behavior. The real escalation began during the formation positioning discussion. Colonel Mitchell was explaining how aircraft would join up and maintain position relative to each other when Kingston interrupted with another question. "Sir, what happens if one of the vintage aircraft can't maintain formation speed or develops mechanical problems? Do we have contingency plans for performance limitations?" The question was ostensibly about safety, but everyone in the room understood its real meaning. Kingston was publicly questioning whether older aircraft, and by extension, their pilots, could handle the demands of formation flying with modern fighters. Victoria finally looked up from her notes, her green eyes meeting Kingston across the room. For a moment, the briefing room fell silent as every pilot present sensed the tension building between the F-22 squadron commander and the quiet woman with the Mustang. "Major," Victoria said, her voice calm but carrying clearly across the room, Are you concerned about the mechanical reliability of properly maintained vintage aircraft or their performance capabilities? Kingston's smile was sharp-edged. Both, actually. These old birds weren't designed for the kind of precision flying we do today. I'd hate to see someone get in over their head trying to keep up with modern aircraft. The condescension in his tone was unmistakable, and several pilots shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This was no longer about flight safety. It had become a public challenge to Victoria's competence. "I appreciate your concern," Victoria replied, her tone remaining professionally neutral. "Though I should mention that the performance specifications of a properly maintained P-51 might surprise you." Martinez leaned forward, unable to resist joining the verbal sparring. "With all due respect, ma'am, there's a reason we don't fly 70-year-old aircraft in combat anymore. Technology has advanced just a bit since World War II. Hayes laughed openly at his squadron mate's comment, earning sharp looks from several of the older pilots in the room. The young lieutenant seemed completely unaware that he was making enemies with every word. "Plus," Hayes added with youthful arrogance, "modern fighters require different skills than those old prop jobs. It's like comparing a sports car to a horse and buggy." The comparison drew an audible intake of breath from Captain Williams, whose grandfather had died flying the horse and buggy Hayes was so casually dismissing. Major Rodriguez's knuckles went white as he gripped his pen, clearly struggling to maintain professional composure. Victoria's expression didn't change, but something subtle shifted in the atmosphere around her. The other Heritage Flight pilots were beginning to recognize what the F-22 squadron had failed to see. They weren't dealing with an amateur airshow enthusiast, but with someone whose quiet confidence suggested depths they hadn't bothered to explore. "Different skills," Victoria repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting perspective, Lieutenant. What would you say are the most important skills for modern air combat?" Hayes straightened, clearly pleased to have an opportunity to demonstrate his expertise. "Situational awareness through advanced sensor fusion, beyond visual range engagement capabilities, stealth employment tactics, and multi-target prosecution using advanced fire control systems." His answer sounded like he was reading from a textbook, which wasn't far from the truth. Victoria nodded politely, then asked a follow-up question that made several experienced pilots in the room smile. "What happens when those systems fail?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a gun barrel. Hayes blinked, clearly not having considered the possibility that his advanced technology might not always be available when he needed it. They don't fail," he said finally, with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced equipment malfunction in a life-threatening situation. "Everything fails eventually," Victoria said quietly. "The question is whether you can still accomplish the mission when it does." Colonel Mitchell, who had been watching the exchange with growing interest, decided to intervene before the situation escalated further. "Ladies and gentlemen, let's focus on today's mission parameters. We'll have plenty of time to discuss aviation philosophy after we've safely completed our demonstration." As the briefing continued, the lines had been clearly drawn. The F-22 pilots had publicly questioned Victoria's competence and dismissed the relevance of her aircraft and experience. In response, she had quietly demonstrated that their technological superiority might not be as absolute as they believed. But the real test was still to come. In a few hours, when they took to the skies over Florida, words would be replaced by actions, assumptions would meet reality, and everyone in that briefing room would discover whether experience and skill could match technology and confidence. The F-22 pilots were about to learn that some lessons couldn't be taught in simulators, and some pilots couldn't be judged by their equipment. They just didn't know it yet. The pre-flight area buzzed with activity as pilots conducted final aircraft inspections and ground crews performed last-minute checks. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the Florida tarmac, creating heat shimmer that made the distant aircraft appear to dance in the superheated air. In 3 hours, thousands of spectators would witness what was advertised as a celebration of American aviation heritage. What they would actually see was about to become something far more dramatic. Victoria methodically worked through her pre-flight checklist, her movements precise and unhurried despite the sweltering heat. The Mustang's polished aluminum skin was almost too hot to touch, but she continued her inspection with the thoroughness of someone who understood that attention to detail was the difference between successful missions and tragic accidents. Nearby, the F-22 pilots conducted their own pre-flight procedures with the casual efficiency of people accustomed to aircraft that diagnosed their own problems and alerted pilots to potential issues through sophisticated computer systems. Their jets sat in air-conditioned comfort, their cockpits climate-controlled environments that isolated pilots from the harsh realities of atmospheric conditions. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While Victoria checked oil levels, examined control surfaces, and tested systems manually, the F-22 pilots relied on built-in test equipment that could identify problems faster and more accurately than human inspection. It was yet another reminder of the technological gulf that separated their worlds. "Look at her," Martinez commented to his squadron mates, making no effort to lower his voice. "Still doing pre-flight inspections like it's 1944? Doesn't she know modern aircraft monitor themselves?" Hayes laughed, wiping sweat from his forehead as he emerged from his air-conditioned cockpit. "Maybe someone should tell her about this little thing called automation. Might save her some time." Reed, who had been unusually quiet during the earlier briefing, seemed more thoughtful as he watched Victoria's methodical inspection. "My dad always said there was something to be learned from the old ways of doing things." "Your dad flew cargo planes. Big difference between hauling freight and air-to-air combat." The conversation might have continued in the same vein, but it was interrupted by the arrival of General Patricia Iron Barnes, the three-star commander of Air Combat Command, whose unannounced visit to the air show had sent ripples of nervous energy through the entire organization. Barnes was a legend in Air Force circles, one of the first female fighter pilots, a veteran of multiple combat deployments, and someone whose reputation for no-nonsense leadership was matched only by her intolerance for arrogance. "Major Kingston," Barnes called out as she approached the F-22 formation, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd commanded air operations over some of the most dangerous airspace. "I trust your squadron is ready for this afternoon's demonstration?" "Yes, ma'am. The 95th Fighter Squadron is ready to represent the very best of modern air cower." Barnes nodded, but her eyes were already moving across the flight line, taking in the various aircraft and their pilots with the keen assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate combat readiness at a glance. When her gaze fell on Victoria and the Mustang, something shifted in her expression. "And our Heritage Flight participants? I assume you've had a chance to meet your formation partners?" "Yes, ma'am. We've briefed safety procedures and discussed formation parameters appropriate for older aircraft." Barnes caught the subtle condescension in his voice, and her expression hardened almost imperceptibly. She'd heard that tone before, usually from young pilots who confused technological superiority with personal competence. "Major, I hope you understand that the Heritage Flight Program represents more than just airshow entertainment. These vintage aircraft and their pilots carried the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades of aerial warfare." "Of course, ma'am, though modern air combat doctrine has evolved considerably since when, Major? Since pilots learned to fly without computer assistance? Since air-to-air combat required pilots to actually see their targets? Since survival depended on stick and rudder skills rather than software?" The questions hung in the air like artillery rounds, and Kingston's confident expression began to waver. He'd walked into a minefield without realizing it, and Barnes was systematically detonating his assumptions. "Ma'am, I only meant that modern fighters offer capabilities that what, Major? That make pilots better, or that make flying easier?" Before Kingston could formulate a response that wouldn't dig his hole deeper, Victoria approached their group. She'd completed her pre-flight inspection and was carrying her helmet and flight gear, her simple appearance contrasting sharply with the F-22 pilot's high-tech equipment.
"General Barnes," Victoria said, extending her hand with a smile that carried genuine warmth. "It's an honor to see you again, ma'am." Barnes's entire demeanor changed as she clasped Victoria's hand. "Vega, I should have known you'd be mixed up in this Heritage Flight business. How long has it been? About 6 years, ma'am, since that conference at Maxwell. The easy familiarity between the General and Victoria sent shockwaves through the F-22 pilots. They'd assumed they were dealing with an amateur enthusiast, not someone who was apparently on a first-name basis with one of the Air Force's most senior commanders. Gentlemen, Barnes said, turning back to the F-22 pilots with an expression that suggested she was enjoying their confusion, allow me to introduce Captain Victoria Cross, call sign Vega, 22 years of service, multiple combat deployments, and more air-to-air kills than anyone currently on active duty. The words hit the F-22 pilots like a physical blow. Hayes actually took a step backward, his face going pale as he realized the magnitude of their mistake. Martinez's mouth fell open, and Reed looked like he was reconsidering every assumption he'd made about vintage aircraft and their pilots. But it was Kingston who recovered first, his political instincts kicking in as he tried to salvage a situation that had just gone from embarrassing to potentially career-threatening. Captain Cross, he said, extending his hand with forced enthusiasm, I had no idea we were flying with someone of your experience. Perhaps we could discuss some tactical considerations for this afternoon's demonstration. Victoria shook his hand, but her expression remained neutral. I'm sure we'll have plenty to discuss once we're airborne, Major. Barnes watched the exchange with the satisfaction of someone who'd taught an important lesson. Major Kingston, I trust you'll take good care of Captain Cross this afternoon. She has more combat experience than your entire squadron combined. As the general moved on to inspect other aircraft, the F-22 pilots were left to confront the wreckage of their assumptions. The quiet woman they'd been mocking all morning wasn't an amateur pilot playing with museum pieces. She was a combat veteran whose credentials dwarfed their own. But instead of graciously accepting their mistake, Kingston's pride kicked in. The humiliation of being corrected in front of a 3-star general, combined with the realization that he'd been wrong about Victoria's qualifications, triggered a defensive response that would prove to be his downfall. Well, Kingston said, his voice carrying an edge that hadn't been there before, I guess we'll see how those old-school skills translate to modern formation flying. The comment was ostensibly about flying technique, but everyone present understood its real meaning. Kingston was doubling down, suggesting that Victoria's combat experience might not be relevant to contemporary aviation requirements. Victoria studied him for a long moment, her green eyes taking the measure of a man whose ego wouldn't allow him to admit error. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but carried clearly in the still air. Major, would you care to make that assessment more specific? The challenge was subtle but unmistakable. Kingston had just been offered an opportunity to back down gracefully, but his wounded pride wouldn't allow retreat. Just that formation flying requires precision and predictability. Modern aircraft and modern pilots train to very specific standards. Sometimes experience from different eras can be incompatible with current procedures. Victoria nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. Around them, other pilots had stopped their own preparations to listen to a conversation that was rapidly escalating beyond professional disagreement. I see, she said finally. And you believe your squadron's training is superior to mine. The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. Kingston realized he'd been maneuvered into a position where any answer would either be a humiliating retreat or an escalating confrontation. His pride made the choice for him. I believe modern training produces more precise results, he said carefully. Victoria's smile was razor thin. Then perhaps we should test that theory. The flight line had transformed into a carefully choreographed dance of preparation as the afternoon demonstration approached. Ground crews scurried between aircraft, performing final checks and coordinating with air traffic control. The sound of jet engines spooling up mixed with the distinctive rumble of the Mustang's Merlin V-12, creating a symphony that spoke to 8 decades of aviation evolution. Victoria sat in her cockpit, running through the familiar ritual that had preceded every combat mission she'd ever flown. Her hands moved across the instrument panel with practiced precision, checking gauges, testing controls, and verifying systems that had been meticulously maintained to wartime standards.
The cockpit was cramped compared to modern fighters, its instruments analog rather than digital, but to Victoria, it felt like coming home. The leather seat had been shaped by thousands of hours of flight time, the controls worn smooth by countless missions. This wasn't just an aircraft to her, it was a time machine that connected her to every pilot who'd ever strapped into a fighter and taken off toward an uncertain fate. The weight of that history settled around her shoulders like armor. Through her canopy, she could see the F-22 pilots conducting their own pre-flight procedures. Their aircraft sat like alien predators on the tarmac, their angular surfaces seeming to absorb light rather than reflect it. Everything about them spoke to technological superiority. Heads-up displays that projected critical information directly onto the pilot's field of view, fly-by-wire controls that made precise maneuvering effortless, and sensors that could track targets at ranges that would have been incomprehensible to World War II pilots. Kingston's voice crackled through the radio, professional but carrying an undertone of anticipation. Heritage Flight Formation, this is Razor Lead. Radio check. Storm 2, loud and clear. Martinez responded immediately. Blaze 3, 5 by 5, Hayes added, his young voice tight with excitement. Titan 4, good copy, Reed concluded. Victoria keyed her microphone, her voice calm and steady. Vega 5, ready. The call sign hung in the air like a challenge. Everyone on the frequency knew what it meant now, that the quiet woman in the vintage fighter was not just another airshow pilot, but someone whose combat record exceeded their own. The revelation had changed everything, transforming what should have been a routine formation flight into something far more significant. Tower, Razor Lead requesting taxi clearance for Heritage Flight Formation. Kingston transmitted. Razor Lead, MacDill Tower, taxi to runway 06, hold short, winds 070 at 12, visibility 10 miles, altimeter 30.15. The formation began moving, a parade of aviation history that attracted attention from everyone on the flight line. Maintenance crews stopped their work to watch, air traffic controllers crowded into the tower cab, and early arriving spectators pressed against the fence to witness something they sensed would be special. Victoria's Mustang rolled smoothly behind the F-22s, its tailwheel configuration giving it a distinctive nose-high attitude that made it appear eager to leap into its natural element. The contrast with the modern fighters was striking. Where they glided with technological precision, the Mustang seemed to strain against gravity with barely contained energy. As they reached the runway, Kingston's voice returned to the frequency. Heritage Flight Formation were cleared for takeoff. Remember, we'll maintain formation integrity and demonstrate the evolution of American air power. Let's make this professional. The words were standard, but Victoria detected something else in his tone, a subtle challenge that suggested the morning's confrontations weren't forgotten. Kingston was still smarting from his humiliation in front of General Barnes, and he was looking for an opportunity to reassert his squadron's superiority. Razor Lead rolling, Kingston announced as his F-22 began its takeoff run. The Raptor accelerated with the smooth power of advanced turbofan engines, its thrust vectoring nozzles adjusting automatically to maintain perfect directional control. Within seconds, it was airborne and climbing with an effortless grace that demonstrated why it was considered the world's most advanced fighter. The other F-22s followed at precise intervals, their takeoffs flawless demonstrations of modern aviation technology. Each pilot executed the maneuver with textbook precision, their aircraft responding to inputs with computer-assisted accuracy that eliminated human error from the equation. Then, it was Victoria's turn. She advanced the throttle smoothly, feeling the Merlin engine respond with a throaty roar that seemed to come from deep within the aircraft's soul. The Mustang surged forward with raw, mechanical power that was fundamentally different from the refined thrust of jet engines. This was aviation in its purest form. Pilot, propeller, and physics working in harmony to achieve the miracle of flight.
At precisely the calculated speed, Victoria eased back on the stick and felt the Mustang leap into the air with an eagerness that jets couldn't match. The transition from ground to flight was immediate and exhilarating, a reminder that some experiences couldn't be replicated by computer simulation or technological enhancement. Vega 5 airborne, she transmitted, her voice carrying a note of satisfaction that didn't go unnoticed by the F-22 pilots. As the formation climbed toward their demonstration altitude, the real test began. Formation flying required absolute precision, with aircraft maintaining exact positions relative to each other while executing complex maneuvers at speeds that left no margin for error. It was a skill that demanded complete trust between pilots and perfect understanding of each aircraft's capabilities. Kingston led the formation through a series of gentle turns, allowing the aircraft to settle into their assigned positions. The F-22s moved with mechanical precision, their flight control computers automatically adjusting for turbulence and maintaining exact spacing. Their pilots appeared relaxed, confident in their aircraft's ability to handle the demanding requirements of formation flying. Victoria tucked her Mustang into position with a smoothness that surprised the F-22 pilots. Instead of the struggling, imprecise flying they'd expected from a vintage aircraft, the P-51 held its position with rock-steady stability. Her control inputs were minimal but perfectly timed, demonstrating the kind of natural flying ability that couldn't be taught in simulators. "Not bad for an antique," Martinez muttered over the intercom, though his tone carried grudging respect rather than mockery. But Kingston wasn't ready to concede anything. As the formation leveled off at demonstration altitude, he began increasing the complexity of their maneuvers, pushing the envelope of what was considered safe for mixed formation flying. His turns became tighter, his speed changes more abrupt, and his altitude variations more demanding. The message was clear. If Victoria wanted to fly with modern fighters, she'd have to prove she could handle modern flying requirements. What Kingston didn't realize was that he'd just issued a challenge to someone who'd learned formation flying in combat, where precise positioning meant the difference between protecting friendly aircraft and watching them die. Victoria had flown escort missions where enemy fighters tried to break up formations, where pilots had to maintain position while under fire, and where the stakes were measured in lives rather than pride. As the formation approached the demonstration area, where thousands of spectators waited to witness what they thought would be a routine air show, Victoria keyed her microphone one final time. "Razor lead, Vega 5, ready when you are." The words were simple, professional, and utterly confident. But everyone on the frequency understood their deeper meaning. Victoria Cross was about to show these young pilots what real flying looked like. The demonstration was about to become something none of them had planned for, a masterclass in aviation skill that would challenge every assumption the F-22 pilots had made about vintage aircraft, their capabilities, and the pilots who flew them. High above the Florida coastline, with thousands of spectators watching from below, the stage was set for a confrontation that would be remembered long after the sound of engines had faded from memory. At 8,000 feet above MacDill Air Force Base, the Heritage Flight Formation began what was supposed to be a routine demonstration of American air power evolution. Below them, nearly 50,000 spectators filled bleachers and crowded against fence lines, their faces turned skyward in anticipation of seeing history come alive. What they were about to witness would exceed every expectation. Kingston led the formation through the opening sequence, a gentle pass down the flight line that allowed the crowd to see the dramatic contrast between World War II and modern technology. The F-22s flew with computer-assisted precision, their movements perfectly coordinated and mechanically smooth. Victoria's Mustang held position with an ease that was beginning to unnerve the F-22 pilots, who'd expected to see obvious signs of struggle from the vintage aircraft. "Looking good, Heritage Flight," the air boss radioed from the control tower. "Crowd's loving the formation. Cleared for your demonstration sequence." Kingston keyed his microphone, his voice carrying to thousands of radio enthusiasts monitoring the airshow frequency. "Roger, MacDill Tower, beginning demonstration sequence." What happened next would be analyzed and discussed in aviation circles for years to come.
Instead of the scripted sequence they'd briefed, Kingston began pushing the formation through maneuvers that tested the limits of mixed aircraft flying. His turns became aggressive, his altitude changes abrupt, and his speed variations designed to expose any weakness in his formation partner's abilities. It was a clear violation of airshow safety protocols, but his wounded ego demanded vindication. The F-22s responded with mechanical precision, their flight control computers automatically compensating for the increasingly demanding maneuvers. Martinez, Hayes, and Reed followed their leader through turns that would have been challenging for aircraft of the same type, let alone a mixed formation spanning 8 decades of aviation technology. But it was Victoria's response that left them speechless. Not only did the Mustang hold position through Kingston's aggressive maneuvering, it seemed to anticipate his intentions. Victoria's control inputs were so smooth, so perfectly timed, that her aircraft appeared to be telepathically linked to the formation lead. When Kingston rolled into a steep bank that should have challenged a vintage fighter, the Mustang rolled with him as if connected by an invisible wire. "How was she doing that?" Hayes whispered over the intercom, his voice tight with disbelief. Martinez, who'd been monitoring Victoria's position through his advanced avionics, provided the answer that none of them wanted to hear. "She's not just keeping up, she's flying better than we are." The realization hit the F-22 pilots like a physical blow. Their computer-assisted aircraft, with their advanced flight control systems and automated stability augmentation, were being outflown by a 70-year-old fighter with manual controls and analog instruments. It defied everything they'd been taught about technological superiority. But Victoria was just getting started. As Kingston rolled into what he thought would be a formation-breaking turn, Victoria didn't just follow, she improved on his line, tucking her Mustang into a position that demonstrated textbook formation flying technique. Her aircraft seemed to float through the maneuver with a grace that made the F-22's computer-assisted precision look crude by comparison. From the ground, Master Sergeant Thompson watched through binoculars with growing amazement. She'd seen thousands of aircraft demonstrations, but what Victoria was doing defied conventional understanding of vintage aircraft capabilities. The Mustang wasn't just keeping up, it was setting the standard for formation excellence. "Colonel Mitchell," Thompson called to the base commander who was watching from the VIP area, "you need to see this." Mitchell took the binoculars and focused on the formation. His experienced eyes immediately recognized what Thompson had spotted. "Jesus," he breathed. "She's flying formation like she invented it." But it was Dr. James Harrison, a World War II aviation historian in the crowd, who noticed something that would change everything. He'd been photographing the Mustang with a telephoto lens when he spotted markings beneath the cockpit that made his blood run cold. "Oh my God," Harrison whispered, his camera trembling in his hands. Through his 400mm lens, he could clearly see what everyone else had missed, a series of small silhouettes painted below the cockpit rail. Kill markings. Not the symbolic representations used on airshow aircraft, but actual combat tallies painted in the faded style used by operational fighters. He counted them twice to be sure. 12 small aircraft silhouettes, each representing a confirmed air-to-air kill. He'd studied enough wartime records to recognize authentic markings when he saw them, and these weren't replicas. They were real. His hands shaking with excitement, he called his colleague at the National Museum of World War II Aviation. "Bill, you're not going to believe this. I'm at MacDill watching a heritage flight demonstration, and there's a P-51 up there with 12 kill markings. 12 confirmed kills, Bill. Do you understand what that means?" Meanwhile, at 8,000 feet, Kingston was running out of ideas. Every maneuver he'd attempted had been matched and exceeded by the woman he'd dismissed as an amateur. His squadron's technological advantage was being systematically dismantled by someone flying with skills that predated their most advanced training systems. Desperate to regain some measure of superiority, Kingston made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his career. He broke from the scripted demonstration and rolled into a knife-edge pass that pushed the limits of airshow safety regulations. It was a maneuver designed to show off the F-22's advanced flight characteristics while forcing the Mustang into a position where its limitations would be exposed. The 3 other F-22 pilots followed their leader, though Reed's voice carried concern over the intercom. "Razor, we're outside briefed parameters." "I've got this," Kingston replied, his voice tight with concentration as he pushed his aircraft into a position that should have been impossible for a World War II fighter to match. Victoria's response was immediate and devastating. Not only did she match Kingston's aggressive maneuvering, she executed the knife-edge pass with a precision that made his flying look amateur by comparison. The Mustang rolled through the maneuver with textbook perfection, its pilot demonstrating the kind of stick and rudder skills that couldn't be programmed into computers or learned in simulators. But it was what happened next that broke Kingston's confidence completely. As the formation leveled out, Victoria smoothly moved her Mustang from the number 5 position to formation lead, executing the position change with such subtle skill that it appeared choreographed. For a moment, the Heritage Flight Formation was being led by a 70-year-old fighter flown by someone whose abilities exceeded anything the F-22 pilots had ever witnessed. "Razor lead," Victoria's voice came over the radio, calm and professional, recommending we return to briefed parameters for crowd safety. The gentle rebuke was delivered with such quiet authority that Kingston found himself automatically responding, "Roger, Vega, good call." As Victoria smoothly returned to her assigned position, the F-22 pilots were forced to confront a reality that challenged everything they thought they knew about flying. They'd just been outflown by someone using technology their grandfathers might have recognized, and the lesson was being delivered in front of 50,000 spectators. On the ground, Dr. Harrison was still on his phone, his voice rising with excitement. "Bill, I've been researching and I think I know who this is. There was a pilot in the Afghanistan and Iraq conflicts, call sign Vega, credited with multiple air-to-air kills flying close air support missions. If this is the same pilot..." Harrison's words were cut off as the crowd around him erupted in applause. The Heritage Flight Formation was completing its demonstration with a final pass down the flight line. But what the spectators were cheering wasn't just the aircraft. They were witnessing a masterclass in aviation skill that none of them fully understood. As the formation prepared to return to base, the F-22 pilots were silent on the intercom, each grappling with the realization that their assumptions about technological superiority had been systematically destroyed by someone's credentials they'd never bothered to investigate. The real revelation was just beginning. Within hours, Harrison's photographs would be circulating through aviation communities worldwide, and the story of the woman with 12 kill markings would transform Victoria from an unknown Heritage flight participant into a legend whose combat record would redefine everything people thought they knew about air-to-air combat in the modern era. But first, they had to land, and Kingston was beginning to understand that the humiliation he'd experienced in the air was nothing compared to what was waiting for him on the ground.
The landing sequence was executed in stunned silence. One by one, the F-22s touched down with computer-assisted precision, their advanced systems automatically adjusting for crosswinds and runway conditions. Victoria's Mustang followed, floating over the threshold with the grace of someone who'd made countless landings under far more challenging conditions than a calm Florida afternoon. As the aircraft taxied back to the flight line, Dr. Harrison was already making phone calls that would reverberate through the aviation community. His photographs of the kill markings had been uploaded to military aviation forums, where experts were frantically trying to identify the pilot and confirm the authenticity of what appeared to be an unprecedented combat record. Within minutes of the formation's return to base, Colonel Mitchell's phone was ringing. General Barnes herself was on the line, her voice carrying the unmistakable tone of someone who just received information that changed everything. "Jim," Barnes said without preamble, "I need you to secure Captain Cross and her aircraft immediately. We've got media inquiries coming in from every major network, and the Pentagon wants a full briefing on her operational history." "Ma'am, what exactly are we dealing with here?" Mitchell asked, though he was beginning to suspect the answer would be extraordinary. 12 confirmed air-to-air kills over Afghanistan and Iraq. Captain Victoria Cross, call sign Vega, has the highest number of confirmed aerial victories of
any pilot currently alive. And apparently, she's been flying under our noses at air shows for the past 3 years without anyone bothering to check her background. The revelation hit Mitchell like a physical blow. He'd been in aviation long enough to understand the significance of those numbers. 12 confirmed kills didn't just make Victoria an ace, it made her one of the most successful fighter pilots in modern history. Meanwhile, the F-22 pilots were conducting their post-flight procedures in shell-shocked silence. Kingston sat in his cockpit staring at instruments that had failed to provide any explanation for what he just experienced. His squadron's technological superiority had been rendered meaningless by someone whose flying skills transcended anything their training had prepared them for. Hayes was the first to break the silence over the squadron frequency. "Sir, what just happened up there?" Kingston's response was barely audible. "We just got schooled by someone who learned to fly when people were actually trying to kill her." As they shut down their engines and climbed out of their aircraft, the F-22 pilots were approached by Master Sergeant Thompson, whose expression carried a mixture of professional respect and barely concealed amusement. "Gentlemen," Thompson said, "Colonel Mitchell would like to see you in the briefing room immediately. And before you ask, yes, this is about Captain Cross." The walk to the briefing room felt like a death march. Word had already spread through the base about the Heritage Flight demonstration, and the looks they received from other personnel ranged from curious to openly amused. Their reputation as the base's elite pilots had been shattered in the span of 20 minutes. Colonel Mitchell was waiting for them with a folder thick enough to serve as a weapon. His expression was unreadable, but the F-22 pilots had enough experience to recognize the calm before a storm. "Gentlemen," Mitchell began, "I think it's time you learned exactly who you've been sharing airspace with this afternoon." He opened the folder and began reading from what was obviously an official military biography. "Captain Victoria Cross, United States Air Force, retired. Call sign Vega. 22 years of active duty service, including multiple combat deployments to Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria." The litany of achievements that followed was staggering. Victoria had flown over 2,000 combat hours, participated in 47 major operations, and been credited with saving countless friendly forces through precision close air support missions. But the next part of her record left the F-22 pilots speechless. "Aerial victories," Mitchell continued, his voice carrying new weight. 12 confirmed air-to-air kills against enemy fighters, making her the highest-scoring ace currently alive and the first American pilot to achieve ace status since Vietnam. Hayes physically staggered at the revelation. 12 kills? How is that possible? We've had air superiority for decades. Mitchell's smile was razor-thin. Captain Cross specialized in close air support missions in contested airspace. She flew ground attack aircraft into areas where enemy fighters were still operational, often without escort, relying on her own skills to survive encounters with hostile aircraft. The explanation painted a picture that none of them had imagined. While they had been training in controlled environments against pilots flying the same aircraft they did, Victoria had been fighting for her life against enemies that wanted to kill her. Every technique she had demonstrated that afternoon had been learned under conditions where failure meant death.
Her first kill, Mitchell continued, was an Iraqi MiG-23 that attempted to intercept her during a close air support mission near Fallujah. She was flying an A-10 Thunderbolt at the time, an aircraft never designed for air-to-air combat. She outmaneuvered the MiG and shot it down with her 30mm cannon. Martinez felt sick to his stomach. An A-10 against a MiG? That's impossible. Captain Cross made a career out of doing impossible things, Mitchell replied. Her tactics were studied and incorporated into Air Force doctrine. She pioneered techniques for using ground attack aircraft in air-to-air roles that are still taught today. The colonel turned the folder and continued. Her most famous engagement was over Syria in 2018. Flying alone in an F-16 on a reconnaissance mission, she encountered 4 enemy fighters, 2 MiG-29s and 2 Su-27s.
Not only did she survive the encounter, she shot down 3 of the 4 aircraft and forced the 4th to retreat. The silence in the briefing room was deafening. These were the kind of aerial victories that belonged in World War II history books, not modern combat reports. Yet Victoria had achieved them using tactics and skills that the F-22 pilots were only beginning to understand. "Why didn't we know any of this?" Reed asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mitchell closed the folder. "Because Captain Cross never sought publicity for her achievements. She was too busy actually fighting wars to worry about building a reputation. She retired quietly 3 years ago and has been participating in heritage flight programs as a way to honor fallen comrades." The implication was clear and devastating. While the F-22 pilots had been building careers based on technological superiority and peacetime training, Victoria had been earning her reputation through actual combat against real enemies. Her quiet confidence hadn't been arrogance. It had been the calm certainty of someone who'd proven herself under conditions they couldn't imagine. Kingston finally found his voice. "Sir, where is Captain Cross now?" "Probably performing post-flight maintenance on her aircraft, the same thing she's done after every mission for 22 years. The difference is that this time, instead of checking for battle damage, she's making sure her museum piece is ready for tomorrow's demonstration." The dismissive term they'd used all morning now carried a weight of irony that made Kingston wince. Victoria's museum piece wasn't just a restored aircraft. It was a living tribute to the pilots who'd fought and died in aerial combat, maintained and flown by someone who'd carried on their traditions in modern warfare. The F-22 pilots filed out of the briefing room. Each was forced to confront the magnitude of their mistake. They dismissed someone whose combat record exceeded anything they might achieve in their entire careers, whose flying skills had been tested under conditions that would have broken lesser pilots, and whose quiet professionalism had shown them what true aerial warfare experience looked like. Outside, Victoria was indeed performing post-flight maintenance on her Mustang, her methodical inspection unchanged by the day's events. She'd faced greater challenges than wounded egos and technological arrogance, and she would continue flying, because that's what warriors did. They flew, they fought, and they honored those who'd paid the ultimate price for the freedoms others took for granted. The F-22 pilots were about to learn that earning her respect would require more than just apologizing for their assumptions. It would require them to confront the difference between flying and fighting, between technology and skill, and between reputation and reality.
The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the flight line as the F-22 pilots approached Victoria's hangar with the uncertain gait of people who had their worldview fundamentally shattered. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted down by the magnitude of their error and the humiliation of having their arrogance so thoroughly dismantled. Victoria was exactly where Colonel Mitchell had predicted, methodically inspecting her Mustang with the same attention to detail she'd shown before the flight. Her movements were unhurried and precise, each action serving a specific purpose in the ritual of post-flight maintenance. To casual observers, she might have appeared to be simply caring for a vintage aircraft. To anyone who understood combat aviation, she was performing the sacred duty of ensuring her weapon remained ready for the next mission. Kingston approached first, his usual swagger replaced by something approaching humility. The man who'd confidently dismissed her that morning now struggled to find words adequate to address someone whose combat record dwarfed his own achievements. "Captain Cross," he began, his voice lacking its earlier condescension, "I owe you an apology." Victoria looked up from her inspection, her green eyes steadying Kingston with the calm assessment of someone who'd learned to evaluate threats and allies with equal precision. She didn't speak immediately, instead setting down her inspection checklist and giving her her full attention. "For what specifically?" she asked, her tone neutral but carrying an expectation of honesty. The question forced Kingston to confront the full scope of his behavior.
for assuming your aircraft was inadequate, for questioning your flying abilities, for treating you like an amateur when you're clearly, well, extraordinary doesn't begin to cover it. Victoria's expression softened slightly, though she remained guarded. I appreciate that, Major, though I should point out that my aircraft's capabilities haven't changed since this morning. Neither have my flying skills. The only thing that's different is your knowledge of my background. The observation hit like a physical blow. Kingston realized that every dismissive comment, every condescending assumption, every moment of arrogance had been based on superficial judgments rather than actual assessment of capability. Victoria had been exactly the same person all along. They'd simply been too blinded by their own prejudices to see it. Martinez stepped forward, his earlier smugness replaced by genuine curiosity. "Ma'am, could I ask about that engagement over Syria? 4 enemy fighters against 1 F-16? How do you survive something like that?" Victoria's response was measured, professional. Training, preparation, and a lot of luck, but mainly understanding that every advantage the enemy has can be turned into a disadvantage if you know how to exploit it. "Could you explain what you mean?" Hayes asked, his youthful enthusiasm now tempered by respectful attention. Victoria glanced around the group, noting their genuine interest, then gestured toward her Mustang. "Take this aircraft, for example. This morning you saw it as obsolete technology. But what if I told you that its simplicity is actually an advantage in certain situations?" The F-22 pilots exchanged puzzled glances. Reed voiced what they were all thinking. How could outdated technology be advantageous? "Electronic warfare," Victoria replied simply. "Your F-22s are marvels of engineering, but they depend entirely on computer systems. What happens when an enemy jams your GPS, corrupts your flight control software, overwhelms your sensors with false targets?" The questions revealed gaps in their training that none of them had considered. Their aircraft were so advanced, so reliable, that they'd never seriously contemplated operating without technological assistance. "This Mustang," Victoria continued, running her hand along the aircraft's wing, "has no computers to corrupt, no GPS to jam, no electronic systems to compromise. It flies the same way whether the enemy has the most sophisticated jamming equipment or Stone Age radios. That's not obsolescence, that's reliability." Martinez was beginning to understand. "So, in Syria, when you faced multiple aircraft, you used their technological advantages against them?" Victoria nodded. "Modern fighters are designed to engage at long range using sophisticated sensors and guided missiles. But what happens when you force them into close-quarters combat, where their technology becomes a liability rather than an asset?" She moved to her aircraft's nose, pointing to the faded kill markings that had caused such a sensation. "Every one of these represents a situation where someone thought technology would guarantee victory. They were wrong." The F-22 pilots gathered closer, drawn by insights they'd never encountered in their formal training. This wasn't theoretical knowledge from textbooks or lessons learned in simulators. This was practical wisdom earned through life-and-death encounters with real enemies.
The Syrian engagement, Victoria continued, started with 4 MiGs trying to bracket me from long range. Their mistake was assuming I'd fight by their rules. Instead, I turned toward them and forced a merge where their numbers advantage became a coordination problem. Hayes was scribbling notes, his earlier arrogance replaced by the eagerness of a student discovering knowledge he'd never imagined existed. How do you turn numbers against themselves? By making the leader's wingmen more dangerous to him than you are, Victoria explained. In close combat, having multiple aircraft in the same airspace creates collision risks and friendly fire concerns. If you can position yourself correctly, the enemy starts worrying more about avoiding their own wingmen than about engaging you. Reed, whose limited combat experience had been in unopposed environments, asked the question that revealed the depth of their inexperience. But how do you know these tactics will work? How do you train for situations where the enemy is actively trying to kill you? Victoria's smile was sad, but understanding. You don't train for it, Captain. You survive it and learn from it. Every engagement teaches you something new about aerial combat that no simulator can replicate. She gestured toward the F-22s parked nearby. "Your aircraft are incredible machines, and you're skilled pilots, but you've been trained to fight a technological war against enemies who'll use your technological dependence against you. Sometimes the old ways work better than the new ones." Kingston found himself asking a question that would have seemed ridiculous that morning. "Would you be willing to teach us? Share some of those tactics you developed?" Victoria studied the group, noting the genuine humility that had replaced their earlier arrogance. These weren't bad pilots, they were products of a system that had emphasized technological superiority over fundamental flying skills. With proper guidance, they could become the kind of complete aviators the Air Force actually needed. "I'll make you a deal," she said finally. "Tomorrow morning, we'll take our aircraft up again. This time, instead of formation flying, we'll work on basic fighter maneuvers. No computers, no advanced sensors, just stick and rudder skills and situational awareness." The offer was unprecedented. One of the most successful combat pilots in modern history was volunteering to personally train them in techniques that couldn't be learned anywhere else. It was an opportunity that could transform their careers and potentially save their lives in future conflicts. Martinez was the first to accept. "Yes, ma'am, I'd be honored to learn from you." One by one, the others agreed, including Kingston, whose wounded pride had given way to recognition of an extraordinary learning opportunity. They were being offered a chance to study under someone whose combat experience was legendary, whose tactical innovations had influenced Air Force doctrine, and whose flying skills had been proven under conditions they could barely imagine. As the sun set over MacDill Air Force Base, the transformation was complete. The arrogant F-22 pilots who dismissed Victoria that morning had become students, eager to learn from a master whose credentials had been earned in the crucible of actual combat. Victoria returned to her post-flight inspection, but now she wasn't alone. The F-22 pilots remained nearby, asking questions about maintenance procedures, aircraft systems, and the philosophical differences between flying for show and flying for survival. The real education was just beginning, and for the first time since arriving at MacDill, Victoria allowed herself to hope that these young pilots might learn something valuable from the hard-won wisdom she had accumulated over 2 decades of aerial warfare. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, and new opportunities for growth. But tonight, the foundation had been laid for understanding that would bridge the gap between technological capability and combat effectiveness, between flying and fighting, between training and survival.
The next morning dawned clear and calm over MacDill Air Force Base, perfect conditions for what would become one of the most memorable training sessions in modern Air Force history. Word had spread through the aviation community about the previous day's events, and the flight line drew an unusual collection of observers, senior officers, visiting pilots, and aviation historians who sensed they were about to witness something extraordinary. Victoria arrived at 0600, 2 hours before the scheduled training session, following her lifelong habit of thorough preparation. Her Mustang set gleaming in the early sunlight, every surface polished to mirror brightness, every system checked and rechecked. But today's preparation involved more than aircraft maintenance. She was planning a curriculum that would challenge everything the F-22 pilots thought they knew about air combat. The F-22 pilots arrived precisely on time, their earlier swagger replaced by the focused attention of students preparing to learn from a master. Kingston approached Victoria with a respect that would have been unimaginable 24 hours earlier. "Ma'am," he said, extending his hand, "thank you for this opportunity. My squadron is ready to learn." Victoria shook his hand, noting the genuine humility in his voice. "Major, before we begin, I want you to understand something. What we're going to practice today isn't about making your aircraft perform better, it's about making you better pilots. The technology will always be there, but someday you might have to fly without it." As they walked toward the briefing room, Victoria outlined the training plan that would occupy the next several hours.
They would start with basic fighter maneuvers, simple exercises designed to develop spatial awareness and aircraft control without relying on computer assistance. Then they would progress to tactical scenarios that emphasized problem-solving over technology dependence. The first lesson, Victoria explained as they gathered around a whiteboard covered with her handwritten diagrams, is understanding that every aircraft has strengths and weaknesses. Your job as a pilot is to maximize your strengths while exploiting your opponent's weaknesses. She drew a simple diagram showing two aircraft in combat. Technology can give you advantages, but it can also create vulnerabilities. The key is knowing when to rely on your systems and when to rely on your skills. The training session that followed would be analyzed and discussed in military aviation circles for years to come. Victoria led the F-22 pilots through exercises that stripped away their technological advantages and forced them to rely on fundamental flying skills. She demonstrated energy management techniques that predated computer assistance, taught them to read their opponent's intentions through aircraft position rather than electronic signatures, and showed them how to think tactically in situations where sensors might be unreliable. Most importantly, she taught them humility. In combat, Victoria explained during a break between training flights, arrogance kills pilots faster than enemy fire. The moment you assume your technology makes you invincible is the moment someone with older equipment and better tactics will prove you wrong. The afternoon brought the second Heritage flight demonstration, but this time, the dynamics had completely changed. Instead of trying to expose Victoria's limitations, Kingston led his squadron in a formation that showcased the combined excellence of old and new aviation. The F-22s flew with precision that complemented rather than competed with the Mustang's grace, creating a demonstration that honored both technological advancement and aviation heritage. From the ground, the 50,000 spectators witnessed something unprecedented, a formation that represented not just the evolution of American air power, but the continuity of warrior spirit across generations. Dr. Harrison, still photographing from the crowd, captured images that would become iconic representations of aviation excellence transcending technological boundaries. But it was General Barnes, watching from the VIP area, who best understood the broader implications of what had occurred. She'd spent her career fighting for recognition in male-dominated aviation, and seeing Victoria's quiet triumph over arrogance and assumption gave her hope for the future of military aviation culture. Colonel Mitchell, Barnes said as the formation completed its demonstration, "I want Captain Cross contacted about returning to active duty. The Air Force needs instructors who can teach the lessons she learned in combat." Mitchell smiled, having anticipated the request. "Already done, ma'am. She's agreed to participate in our Advanced Fighter Tactics program. Starting next month, she'll be teaching courses on air combat survival and tactical innovation." The news represented more than just a career opportunity. It was recognition that experience and wisdom were as valuable as technology and training. Victoria's combat record had earned her a place in aviation history, but her teaching ability would ensure that her knowledge lived on in future generations of pilots.
As the air show concluded and the crowds began to disperse, the F-22 pilots gathered around Victoria's Mustang for a final conversation. The aircraft that they dismissed as a museum piece now commanded their respect as a symbol of aviation excellence that transcended technological limitations. "Ma'am," Hayes said, his youthful voice carrying a new maturity, I want you to know that today changed how I think about flying. About everything, really." Victoria smiled, remembering her own transformation from cocky young pilot to combat-tested aviator. "Lieutenant, the best pilots never stop learning. The moment you think you know everything is the moment you become dangerous to yourself and your wingmen." Martinez raised a question that had been troubling him since the previous day's revelation. How do we honor what you've taught us? How do we make sure other pilots learn these lessons without having to discover them in combat? Victoria's answer would become the foundation for changes in Air Force training doctrine that persists to this day. You teach them what I taught you. You share the knowledge that warriors before us paid for with their lives. And you remember that every flight, whether in training or combat, is an opportunity to become a better pilot and a better person. As the sun set over MacDill Air Force Base for the second time, the transformation that had begun with mockery and ended with respect was complete. The F-22 pilots had learned lessons that couldn't be found in technical manuals or training syllabi, lessons about humility, respect, and the timeless value of warrior wisdom. Victoria's story would spread through the aviation community, inspiring changes in training programs and attitudes that would benefit pilots for generations to come. Her quiet triumph over technological arrogance became a case study in military academies, a reminder that experience and skill could never be replaced by equipment and automation. 6 months later, when Kingston's squadron was deployed to a contested region where electronic warfare made their advanced systems unreliable, they would draw on the lessons Victoria had taught them. Her influence would save lives, prevent losses, and validate the ancient truth that warriors learn best from other warriors who face the ultimate test. The woman who'd been dismissed as an amateur had proven that excellence transcends technology, that wisdom earned through combat is more valuable than confidence built through simulation, and that the measure of a pilot isn't found in their equipment, but in their ability to accomplish the mission regardless of circumstances. Victoria Cross, call sign Vega, had reminded an entire generation of aviators that some lessons could only be learned from those who'd paid the price to master them. Her legacy would live on in every pilot who understood that true aviation excellence came not from the sophistication of their aircraft, but from the depth of their commitment to the warrior traditions that connected them to every pilot who'd ever taken off toward an uncertain fate. The most powerful victory Victoria had proven was sometimes simply refusing to be defined by others' assumptions, while remaining true to the warrior spirit that made all other achievements possible.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.